Welcome to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. Welcome to this final event, which is part of a three-part learning series on summer youth employment programs brought to you by the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions, our friends at CLASP, our partners at the National League of Cities, and at the National Youth Employment Coalition. I'm Monique Miles, and I'm a vice president at the Aspen Institute, and I have the honor and privilege of co-leading the Opportunity Youth Forum and Fund. And our work supports rural, urban, and tribal communities around the United States to bring together cross-system and cross-sector partners to improve education and career outcomes for young adults who are out of school and out of work. And it's an honor to be here with you all this afternoon. If you are just joining us, we want to say welcome to you again. And as you are coming into this session, we invite you to introduce yourself with everyone via the chat feature. Please, based on the prompts you see before you, respond in the chat feature to share your name, your organization, and your location. We're also curious to hear you share briefly this summer what was something that surprised you in your community and what happened that was innovative. Again, we want to encourage you to get to know each other and share a little bit more about your work if you haven't done so already. So please go ahead and use that chat feature to respond to the prompts that you see before you. Today's event follows the learning series arc of going from practice to policy. In the first session on February 18th, if you were with us, you may recall that the National Youth Employment Coalition workshop was on innovating together for summer 2021 virtual internships. We took a deep dive into how one school-based program, DC Prep Next, built its meaningful virtual curriculum, including career coaching and leadership experience. Last week, for those of you who were able to join us, in the Expanding the Summer 2021 Youth Jobs Toolkit, we held lively discussions among city leaders and practitioners to share strategies on topics like employer partnerships, preparing young people for remote work, and incorporating a trauma-informed healing center lens into work-based learning. That event drew on the Digital Summer Youth Employment 2.0 Toolkit, and that we at Aspen released in December, which you'll see a link to in the chat. Today, at our final event in this series, Taking Stock and Seizing the Moment, we're zooming out to more of a policy perspective, drawing on what we've learned from a national survey of summer youth employment program providers and local funding agencies to assess the challenges and opportunities communities face in an extraordinary time. Our conversation today will preview the results of 3 fact sheets jointly released today by Aspen and CLASP, woohoo, go CLASP, which you'll be able to receive briefly. As a friendly reminder, this session is being recorded. We look forward to getting that recording out to you all as soon as we possibly can. And we want to just encourage you not only to continue to use the chat feature, but if you have questions, go ahead and use the Q&A feature so that we can try as best as we possibly can to respond to your questions in a timely manner. So this is an extraordinary moment of economic challenge for young people, as we all know. In January, unemployment for 16 to 19-year-olds was nearly 15% more than double the national rate of 6.3%, which again, it was at nearly 15%, and nearly 10% for young adults ages 20 to 24. Racial disparities are sharp. Nearly 1 in 5 Black teens is unemployed. We know from past recessions that youth get put to the back of the line in hiring in favor of older workers with more experience or education. And this is even more challenging because of the concurrent disruption in education, both in schools and post-secondary institutions. Once you add in and intersect the lens of race into the challenges that young adults face, we understand that the disparities aggregate, and BIPOC youth and Latinx youth are disproportionately impacted by these historical and real-time inequities. Therefore, with all of these inequities and how they intersect to create barriers to opportunity for the young people we all care about, we are excited to focus on summer youth employment programs as one important piece of the continuum of place-based opportunities and supports that keep young people meaningfully connected to work and education. Summer youth employment provides critical income to families, as we all know, mostly Most importantly, it is a meaningful work experience. For many young people, that first time connection to a work experience that's not only associated with critical skill development, but also improved academic outcomes. And for students in high school, summer comes after 2 disrupted academic years. So opportunities for paid, high quality work-based learning offers ways to meaningfully connect to post-secondary planning and to career development. And for opportunity youth, summer job programs offer an accessible way to reconnect to work with the support of caring adults, off-ramps to post-secondary education or training to continue their trajectory toward a family-sustaining career. And for all participants, summer youth employment offers an important paycheck and a chance to build professional networks and career connections that have a full-time, life-paying benefit. As you'll hear from Kisha, we need multiple types of investments and career opportunities for young people. But over the past decade plus, since the last recessions, when summer job programs were a part of the federally funded recovery package, we've learned a lot about how these programs can be effective, how to make them inclusive, how to ensure they not only serve, but can meaningfully meet the needs of opportunity youth and connect them to a broader array of pathways. And we certainly learned a lot from the summer of 2020 as local policymakers, funders, employers, practitioners, and young leaders themselves rallied to respond with innovation and resilience to the challenges of COVID, the economic crisis, and once again, the long-standing, intensified racial injustices that so many communities and young people we care about deeply have faced. So before we go on, we will want to take a quick pulse check from everyone just to see who's here in addition to what you've shared in the chat. You'll see a Zoom poll appear on your screen in a moment, and we're going to ask you to respond accordingly. The first question is, what role do you have regarding summer youth employment in your community? Are you a public funder? Are you a program provider, a private funder, researcher, employer, participant? Please let us know. And the results are coming in. Okay. And it looks like we can share some top results. Hopefully you're able to see this on a screen. Great. So it looks like about 14% of us gathered together here today are funders, 56% of us are program providers, 8% employers. We have 4% policymakers and system leaders, and 18% technical assistance providers or other workforce partner programs. As you all know, our aim in these conversations is to ensure that we are having these conversations across sectors and across systems so that we are really aligned in our strategies, that we are continuously sharing what we're learning, and we're able to meaningfully bring this information forward and how we are designing programs. So it's so wonderful to just have a sense of who's with us today and how we may cross-pollinate learning to get to the outcomes we all collectively seek. Alrighty, so now we are starting another poll because we do have another question that we would love for you all to respond to. So our second question is, has summer youth employment started recruiting yet for this summer in your community? Yes, no, or not sure. If you work on a national scale, do you know the answer for where you live? Because here in Washington, D.C., for example, applications for the local program opened on January 29th, and they closed this Saturday. So we're just curious to get a sense based on where people are, what your answers may be. So I'm going to go ahead and okay, great. You all can see the results, and it looks like about 45%. Yes, it's opened already, and got about 45% no, and just 11% at not sure. So again, it's always helpful to be able to just in real time get a sense of where people are. And most importantly, as it relates to the answer to this question, having a sense of where communities are in regard to planning for summer youth employment. It's not at all surprising to see that work, of course, is well underway. And we know that all the work experiences are, focused specifically on the summer, we recognize it takes months of planning and preparation and execution year round in order to get this right. So once again, it's just really good to have a sense of where people are. Thank you to everyone for participating in that poll. And we are going to take this poll down and go on to the next screen because we just want to give you all a sense of what our time together today is going to look like. So in regard to our agenda, we have just done a quick welcome, gotten to get a sense of who's with us today. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague from the Aspen Institute, Mike Swigert, who I want to give a big shout out to. He's done a great job of helping to prepare this content and organize it for you today. He'll do a quick summary on lessons learned from summer 2020. What should we carry forward as we're planning our work for the upcoming summer? Then we'll turn it over to our esteemed colleague, partner, and friend, Kisha Bird at CLASP, who's going to share some policy considerations. And then last but not least, Shuna Hayward, Vice President of Programs from Connect Detroit, is going to share the very critical community perspective. I want to say again, thank you to Kisha, thank you to Shuna, thank you to all of our partners who have just been key co-designers in bringing this content before us together today. With that, I want to turn it over to you, Mike.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Monique. October, can you do the next slide, please? We just want to give a quick thank you to all those partners that you heard about, and also acknowledge some of our funders, JPMorgan Chase, who's been a longtime leader in summer youth employment space, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who supported the development of this toolkit that we referenced, and I just pasted the link again in the chat, the Andrus Family Fund and the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. Next slide, please. So it's great to be with you all this afternoon and to share the results of this survey that I think many folks here on the line participated in. In October, we, Aspen and CLASP, conducted a national survey on summer youth jobs programs. We received complete responses from 73 organizations across 60 communities in 30 different states. Respondents were in 3 categories: local funders of programs such as cities or workforce boards, program providers, and agencies that serve as both local funders and program providers. Responses came from the Opportunity Youth Forum Network, the Communities Collaborating for Reconnecting Youth Network that CLASP convenes, as well as the networks of our partners at the National Youth Employment Coalition, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the National League of Cities. So we had pretty diverse representation, particularly among large cities, smaller cities, and even some rural communities. I will note that New York City, which typically has a whopping 75,000 participants in its summer youth employment program prior to COVID, is not included among survey respondents, although we've interviewed multiple New York stakeholders as part of research for our toolkit in this learning series, and I see some folks from at least 3 boroughs in the chat there. Next slide, please. Actually, can you go back one, Bucktower? Or go skip one ahead. These might be in the wrong order. To most respondents move forward. Perfect. So this is the headline at the top on what we learned from this survey. And this sounds very basic, but a headline finding from this study is that most programs were able to adapt to the economic and health challenges of the pandemic and carry out a modified program in 2020. Among respondents to this survey, 82% carried forward with their SYEP, while under 1 in 5 canceled. Those operators that did decide to cancel their program did so primarily due to health and safety concerns, and I'll talk about funding instability as a contributing factor in a minute. Overall, over 53,000 young people participated in summer work experiences across the communities represented by this survey, and that's 2/3 of the total goal that these programs had set for 2020 prior to the pandemic, and nearly 80% of the total served in 2019. There was great variation among programs in how much they scaled down overall, but this aggregate number, I think, represents the resilience of the community infrastructure that includes systems leaders, community-based organizations, employers, and young people needed to carry forth these programs. Of course, numbers served is a meaningful but insufficient metric, and we also have to think about quality, which I'll get to in a moment. Next slide, or the SYEP funded slide. Thank you. So the survey asked about how programs were funded, and what we heard is similar to what we know from past research. Most SYEP programs are locally funded through city general funds. Cities and mayors have been leaders in this work, but there are opportunities for braiding public funding. And with states and localities facing such challenging and volatile budget predictions over the past year, that uncertainty translated into uncertainty in planning among program providers. The two biggest components of costs for summer jobs programs are, of course, staffing and participant wages. While about 40% of respondents reduced the duration of their program, only 18% reduced their compensation levels to participants, reflecting a shared understanding of how critical this earned income is to young people. Yet programs also faced additional costs in adapting to the pandemic last summer. So collaboration across systems and public agencies, as well as private funders stepping up, is critical and remains a concern for this summer in ensuring equitable access for young people experiencing the most vulnerability. Next slide, or the challenge slide. Yeah, so I'm taking us into some of the challenges for the program, and this survey asked about challenges in a couple different ways. Which challenges were the most difficult in resolving, and which had the most detrimental impact despite your best efforts? And in these policy briefs, which were published today, that we're highlighting two buckets of challenges here, those that have long existed and were heightened by the pandemic, and new challenges. So in the first category, I already talked about unreliable funding, and in particular, that's a challenge when you think about the budget cycle for, in localities in comparison to the program planning cycle for summer jobs programs. Among the survey respondents who canceled their programs, 1/3 rely solely on city general funds to operate, and funding reductions, if not total cuts, unsurprisingly affects capacity to serve young people. Of respondents whose enrollment fell below 20% of their original goal, most of them struggle with funding cuts. Securing employer partners to host work experiences is often one of the most difficult parts of a summer youth employment program. And last summer, this was acute with the economy in crisis. The service sector was reeling. There were closures to summer camps, which often employ many young workers. That said, many employers stepped up in partnering with community-based organizations and local systems leaders to design meaningful work experiences for young people. The two new challenges there shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Health and safety, of course. What was interesting from the survey was that while there was widespread concern, general anxiety around health and safety, it seemed like mostly programs were able to address this, although programs reduced the capacity and number of young people they were serving to comply with social distancing requirements for in-person components. Nearly 60% of respondents said that safety concerns were not very or not at all detrimental to program success. Tech infrastructure, though, was a huge issue with everything going remote, and this is an acute challenge that programs face going forward, both in terms of access to devices and broadband, infrastructure among providers and all the adults working with young people, and digital literacy. Next slide, please. So with all these challenges came serious innovations, and I saw a couple of people use the word of 2020 in the chat there. That's pivot, 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 pivot. That is what the field did. The biggest innovation I think that we saw was virtual internships. And for folks who were present in our last session in this learning series, we talked a lot about that. And we also offer more specific strategies and resources related to virtual work-based learning in the digital SYEP toolkit that I just posted there. What we learned from this survey was some promising evidence. Programs that added or expanded virtual employer-hosted work experiences like internships were less likely to report struggling with youth engagement. And an obvious benefit of internships is that young people gained experience in remote work environments, which were increasingly common prior even to the pandemic. And despite challenges, many young people were able to build connections and expand their professional networks, not just with program staff, but with employers, supervisors as well, despite the challenges of doing so in a virtual environment. There's some emerging principles for quality virtual internships, and that's definitely something which we're excited to continue to work with the field to explore and define. One needs to provide technology and training on digital tools on how to work remotely, both to young people and to employers. Structuring frequent opportunities for youth to receive feedback from supervisors and program staff is always important, but even more so when you can't do so face-to-face. And virtual work-based learning can be meaningful if it's designed around projects that meet a business need and leverage youth participants' strengths and interests. 3 other innovations we saw were youth as community crisis responders. In some communities, as when young people were set up to respond to getting information out, particularly to other young people or marginalized communities, across language differences, across differences of disabilities. We saw in places like Chicago, where the Chicago Service Corps was set up in conjunction with the Summer Jobs Program. Young people were part of the solution, and not just experiencing a worse placement while everything else was going on, but being part of responding to COVID or engaging in leaning into conversations around racism and injustice and civic engagement for young people who are activated around that. We also saw something which we saw less frequently, but I think is an emerging direction for the field to go, were some partnerships for earn and learn opportunities for young people to get paid to earn college credit while also engaging in career readiness activities. And we saw some business process efficiencies in online engagement in terms of the operational nuts and bolts of summer jobs programs. But I want to really be cautious here. We did not find that it's cheaper to run virtual programs or to run programs that are blended during a pandemic. There are some specific things that can be done around streamlining processes or engaging more parts of a large company through for example, virtual town halls or large webinars to expose young people to different career options that employers like, but it's not a substitute for in-person learning, and there are additional costs around that technology access and capacity building, like I mentioned. So with that, I will hand it over to Kisha Bird to discuss considerations for policy and programs.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Monique, for opening us up. We really learned a whole lot. We started having these conversations, I was just thinking, last spring. So we've been having these engaged conversations about, one, what was going to happen during summer 2020. And I know, Shuna, you joined us in a couple of those. Then the second one was what did happen. And then in the beginning of this year with our partners who, Mike and Monique have already acknowledged, we started digging in to better understand challenges, to better understand innovations. And what we know is that the field has really been resilient, has pivoted, and young people have showed up, and y'all have showed out. And so what we want to be able to do is to say, well, what are the policy and program considerations do we need to be thinking about, not only at the national and federal level, but also in our communities, and how, those percentage of funders who are joining us today and systems leaders talk to their colleagues about how important these investments are in the ecosystem of workforce education and training, supports and strategies that all young people need, especially young people of color. So Monique talked a little bit about the framing and the context in terms of unemployment. And so I did just a quick search in the US Department of Labor Bureau of Labor Statistics, and wanted just to see how did last summer compare to when we had the Great Recession in 2009. And what I found is the unemployment rate, according to BLS, for young people 16 to 24 during July, which is peak youth employment time, especially in the summer, was exactly the same, 18.5%. So we know at that time we had a federal response. It was a federal response that allowed for an infusion of over $1.5 billion into states and communities for youth jobs, and in particular focus on summer jobs. So we get a sense of the urgency, and we're actually in a pandemic. One other thing I like to say is that in some CLASP data that we pulled, which really looked at the census data, pulse data during COVID, during the last week in July, and it's a different measurement, but during the last week in July, we saw unemployment for young people of color near and upwards of 50%. So it's important not only to see the overall, but to really think about Black, African-American, Latinx, Asian American, Indigenous young people as we think about these contexts. So what did we know? We know that you all responded to COVID-19. We need federal funding continuously sustained for summer youth employment. And that was beyond COVID. It means that we haven't had a separate federal funding stream since WIA. And so and what WIOA did was allow for a work experience set aside. And so what we've been advocating for with many of our friends is a separate funding stream for summer youth employment that is connected to year-round employment and other work-based learning opportunities. And that is critical. We also know, and Mike mentioned it, that we're still in a pandemic and summer is coming up and half of you all already started or finishing your recruitment. We will need support and funding for PPE, technology infrastructure, hardware, so that you all can respond to what young people need and communities need. Next slide. And so I mentioned that how important it is really to think about equity as we think about the populations and young people that we are serving. And so we have to establish some kind of measurements, some kind of goals for that. So we really think it's important that summer youth employment programs are part of broader equity strategies that target specific populations, clearly and importantly, opportunity youth, which some researchers estimate has tripled during this pandemic time. And we had done a lot of work collectively as a field to get the number of out of school and out of work young people, opportunity youth, down to just about 4.5 million. And now it's estimated it's likely to have tripled. So we need to really establish these benchmarks and goals, not just during this recovery period, but over the long term, so that we can be able to have supported, economically viable communities in which young people are able to thrive throughout their teens, their 20s, and into adulthood. Funding for employer engagement. You heard Mike talk about some of the challenges and some of the innovations, but that is really, really critical. And we know when we have tough labor markets, that young people are not necessarily the first to be hired. And we know that they were disproportionately impacted by unemployment because of the industries in which they were most likely to be working in. So that's retail and sales and servers and cooks. And they account for nearly 24% of all workers in low wage positions. So we have to really think about funding and the connectivity for employer engagement, so we can really think about pathways to good jobs and other opportunities. And we have an opportunity to really think about the virtual internships that you all talked about. How can we embed this into our policy, not only just in recovery, but as we think about reauthorizations of WIOA. Next slide, please. And what I love about doing this series with Mike and our colleague Noelle Teason as well, who helped to put this together, is we found some really beautiful nuggets of the work y'all did. And we definitely want to be able to lift those up with our colleagues at the Department of Labor, in the White House, as well as in states and local communities. We have to continue this spirit of innovation. We learned so much. And so we cannot be working on systems and structures that are responding to yesterday's issues, but we have to make sure our systems are flexible enough, right, to bring us into the next year, the next decade, the next generation of the types of programs that we know are necessary. So we have to really think about how we engage young people. And when we met in this the last session we had in the fall, we had some young people who talked about their experiences and to talk about what was challenging for them, but also what they gained. And so we have to really be cognizant of how do we continue the spirit of innovation. What we always talk about is how do we deepen these connections? We had a little bit of bright spots in terms of post-secondary pathways, but summer youth employment programs, as you know, can be so critical to post-secondary planning. They can be critical for high school students. They are critical for out of school and out of work students, opportunity youth, in terms of work experience. So they considering the range of partnerships, especially with post-secondary institutions, is one area where we can deepen connections. And then the last one is what I started off with. And I know many of you are in your communities and your states are talking about recovery plans. We have to make sure that summer youth employment is a part of recovery plans. It shouldn't be the only thing, but it definitely should be one of the main things we include. We know this is a critical time in young people's development and in their lives. And we know how important summer youth employment wages and stipends are to low-income young people in terms of what they need for supplies and schools and helping and supporting their families. So I'll turn it over to you, Shuna, to hear from your community perspective. I'm really excited to hear what you have to bring with us today.
Hi, Shauna. Sorry, you're muted.
You're muted.
Knew I was going to do that. Thank you, Kisha. So it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Thank you, Kisha. Thank you, Mike, and the whole team at Aspen and CLASP, really, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And what I thought was that since I was asked to bring a community perspective, I was thinking that I'd like to start with an African concept, specifically attributed to the Xhosa people, that is at its core about community. And that concept is Ubuntu. I am because you are. Or in other words, it's not about me, but it's about we, right? And so when I think about the story of 2020, I don't think about the story of COVID and the pandemic, but the story of Ubuntu. So as we reflect on 2020 and what happened that year, the things that come to mind, if you can advance to the next slide. Here's some of the things that come to mind when I start to reflect on 2020 and what happened, right? It was a summer for SYEPs of really innovating under pressure. We had to invent this whole shift to a virtual experience. We had to take into consideration safety in everything that we did because of this virus that was out there killing people. And we had to come up with creative solutions to new problems that emerged practically every day while we were doing this. So that is innovating under pressure. And what we ended up with was not just SYEP, but SYEP on steroids, right? SYEP plus in Detroit and in communities across the country. We took our traditional programming and we had to deliver it in non-traditional ways. We had to really think critically about the supports that were required to do this in these circumstances, the technology, the basic needs, the physical and the mental well-being of the folks we were serving. And in addition, we not only had to think about those supports that were needed, but we had to cast a wider net with those supports, right? So it wasn't just with our young people now. We had to think about families. We had to think about the broader community. We had to think about our partners, staff, and of course ourselves in all of this. And even in thinking about my staff, when we made the shift to working from home and sheltering in place, now, all of my team members had laptops at home or printers, sitting around at home. I don't even think people under 30 still print things at all. So we had to, rally resources to provide just even for our staff, let alone the young people we were serving and the community at large. And in addition, the notion of logistics took on, gargantuan proportions. Logistics had a whole new meaning as we tried to navigate our way through this experience. And so it became SYEP plus. And the way that we got through it in Detroit, for me, was really to lean into our core values so that we could come out on the other side of this with the same outcomes that we were hoping for. And so for us, we leaned into still our qualities, our values of quality and collaboration, and infusing positive youth development principles into the work that we were attempting even through the pandemic. And so I've said it before, and I'll say it again, it was a heavy, heavy lift in 2020. And it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And so at the end of the day, as many of you have heard before, the juice was worth the squeeze. We hear from our partners, we hear from our young people that it was still important that these opportunities were made available. In fact, they were even more important during the summer of 2020. So given all of that and taking stock, what did we learn from all of that squeezing and all of that juice, right? One thing that I want to lift up in particular is really just the power of community organizations. Community-based, faith-based intermediaries, we had to be effective. We were nimble, responsive, and resourceful in addressing what we needed to do in 2020 through our SYEPs. As Kisha said earlier, people showed up and showed out for our youth, for our families, and for communities. The other thing I want to lift up is just the power of young people and youth in this, right? As leaders, as partners, and as responders to all of the crises that were going on. And there were many, as talked about before. There's not just the pandemic happening, but there was the elevation of the racial injustice in this country. There was the economic crises that was exacerbated by the pandemic. And so our young people showed up and they were ready to put it on the line. I think about my own daughter. She was 18 last summer and she was getting ready to go out to one of the protests in Detroit. And she got a bottle out of the recycling. She was putting milk in it. And I said, you know, what's that for? She says, for the tear gas. So even though she was going out to peacefully protest, she understood that she might not be met or received in that way. And she was ready to put it on the line. And though it terrified me and I wanted to lock her up and slam the door, I had to see in that the lesson of the power in our young people to lead and step up and to put it on the line. The other thing I wanted to lift up in terms of the taking stock and what we learned was, as was talked about before, just the power of the pivot, people. We did some shifting, some changing. We did some of everything in 2020 to make it happen. As an example, in the city of Detroit, there was a collaboration of private, public, philanthropy, and community that generated $23 million to put technology and internet into the hands of over 50,000 young people and families. And that is the power of the pivot. The other thing, undertaking stock, is the power of connection, right? Fundamentally, SYEPs are about creating opportunities for our young people to build meaningful relationships, to build that social capital, to build those connections. And we learned even more so how critical that was when that was snatched away from us last summer. And we had to figure out how to yet do that in a virtual space. And so we got busy, we got innovative, we got creative, and we were still able to do it. And we know yet that creating opportunities for reflection and processing and making meaning of experiences is one of the best practices of youth development. And so we had to still figure out how to do that through a summer where we're all feeling so disconnected and separated. And so the power of connection was really elevated in the summer, and then the innovation and creativity to sustain and maintain that under pandemic conditions. And so taking all of that, the what happened and what it means, how do we use that to seize this particular moment in history? What's needed and what's next? And so a few things come to mind for me as we do that. One, first and foremost, we were operating under, and we still are to some degree, crisis conditions, right? So it's intense, it's stressful, and so we cannot live here. We can take all of the lessons, we can take all of the innovations, apply what's needed, toss what's not, but we can't live in this space of crises. So even though we may love rolling out of bed in front of the laptop, I don't miss the commute at all. There's going to come a time, people, when we're going to have to get back together. At the heart of this work is connections and relationship building. So this is not our home. Secondly, if we haven't already, need to begin to elevate and advocate for this notion that SYEP, this work is social justice, right? We need to begin to help shift our thinking and that of our partners, philanthropy, and policymakers. The work that we're doing is really a microcosm of what we want to see happen for our country and for everyone. And to the point of equity that Kisha mentioned earlier as well, this idea of we all may be experiencing the same storm, but we're in different boats. And so we need the resources to address what's needed for different and specific populations. In particular, we learned some lessons around what's needed for mental health. We learned some lessons around what's needed for technology. And those aren't going to go away as we begin to continue to dive into this work. And we need to continue with the flexibility and the innovation and the creativity that emerged in 2020. And so as I started with the concept of Ubuntu, I want to circle back to that and share with you a quote from Nelson Mandela on that concept. And what Nelson Mandela, the prolific leader, says is that in Africa, there is a concept known as Ubuntu, the profound sense that we are human only through the humanity of others. That if we are to accomplish anything in this world, it will, in equal measure, be due to the work and achievement of others. And so in closing, I would like to just circle back and just say that the story of 2020 and the story of SYEP is the story of Ubuntu. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Shuna. That's a hard act to follow, but thank you so much for grounding us in the humanity and community of this work. That was, you touched on a lot of incredibly powerful themes there. And that's one reason I think we always want to center what we're doing for those of us working at the national level in the particular experiences of a specific community, because this work happens in place, you build relationships in place, you address challenges in place. So thank you for that. Kisha, do you want to take us away? We've got a few questions in the Q&A and the chat, but folks can keep those coming.
Yeah, sure. I can get us started. So, Shuna, maybe you can take this first question in the chat. Folks were wondering, as employers are increasing wages, and we know that that is a topic that is hot nationally in terms of minimum wage, and that all people, including young people, need to get paid for the work they're doing. But as they increase wages, it's challenging to compete with program funding. And if at the program level, at the local level, you raise your pay rates, it means you're serving less young people. So, how have you, or if you know of any of your colleagues in other cities or communities, have successfully achieved employer funding support in order to achieve some balance and still serve a large number of young people?
Right, that's an excellent question and an ongoing challenge that we need to address in this work. One of the things that we recognized a few years ago, it was a gap for us in Detroit in terms of our funding and the diversity of resources that were being applied to the program. And so we set out with a strategy to recruit employers as partners, but have them pay the wages for the young people. And we offered two flavors. One, if they were in a position to, they would cover the full amount. The other flavor was we would subsidize or go with a 50-50, like we would take half and they would take half. And so that helped to get us part of the way. And there were many employers that stepped up to the table and were fully on board. Those that wanted to but weren't fully able were still able to come to the table. So that's one way in which we approached it in Detroit. The other way was inviting employers to the table that kind of already did this. They had their internship programs, but they were willing to come under the umbrella of the Grow Detroit's Young Talent program that we offer and, you know, buy into kind of the standards and the quality and the other things that we offer, but still fully cover the expense of employing the young person. And so
Yes.
those are our affiliate partners.
Thanks, Shauna. My answer to that, and I know there's also a attendee colleague in Denver saying it's an issue. My response at doing national policy and advocacy is that we want that percentage in terms of who supports summer youth employment that Mike showed earlier to be a little bit more evenly distributed. So it's not only on you know, local and city funds, but that there is a federal and national share there that balances this out, as we want to raise the floor in terms of jobs, that we want young people also to have a minimum wage and to remove the sub-minimum wages in the federal statute, which is for young people and for those with disabilities. And so, you know, that's one thing. How do we expand our funding streams in terms of philanthropy, employers, federal, and state, so that we're not making a scarcity choice, but we're actually making an equity choice. And so there's another question here that's related, and maybe Mike, you can take this and Shauna jump in as well. What suggestions do you all have or recommendations of how funders can incentivize employer engagement as they design summer youth employment programs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's also a policy angle there, and if you're talking about public funders, and this is beyond just summer jobs programs, but there's a range of tax credits and subsidies for employers to support work-based learning more broadly, with SYEP as a component of that. And I'd defer to Kisha on specific recommendations there. At a community or a programmatic level, I think one great example that I saw is really working with engaging employers and the business community with the summer youth employment program as part of the city's overall economic development and talent development strategy. It's integrating those things. You know, a summer jobs program is just one component of the talent development system. A great example of this, just earlier this week, the Philadelphia Youth Network, Philadelphia Works, and some other partners hosted the kickoff of their Philly Summer Jobs Fund that some of you may have been on that webinar, and which was a great event that included employers, philanthropy, government leaders from multiple agencies, and the CBO community coming together with sort of a shared investment. And that's because I think that is reflective of how in Philadelphia they've worked over time to align all these systems, including the business community, around a shared young adult talent development framework and understanding young people as part of economic development for the city. That's maybe a broad answer, but I think that's a strategy I'd recommend.
Yeah. Shauna, do you have anything to add to that? What are some recommendations for funders and how they can incentivize employer engagement?
Incentivize, I'm not sure if this speaks to that, but what came to mind for me is the notion of building the pipeline, right? We have employers that are going to be in need of quality employees. And so our SYEP runs from 14 to 24. Those 18 to 24-year-olds could be prime candidates to fill some of those seats that are coming. There are a lot of high growth, high demand industries. So establishing those relationships, helping the supply side meet the demand side in intentional ways through what we can accomplish through the learnings and enrichment and experiences that young people get through the SYEP. It makes it a win-win.
Thank
So
you.
add one thing to that, Kisha, that connects to what Mike said and some of what Shuna said, which is that, you know, we also so often talk about summer youth employment as this year-round learning opportunity. So another way that funders can be incentivized to really support this work with employers is trying to connect some of those private dollars to the corporate dollars in ways that can continue these pathways year-round, so that young people are continuously building skills and are then ready for those summer opportunities to meaningfully essentially use those opportunities in ways that continue to build critical skills. But I think, you know, funders can play this really key role in helping to support those pathways much more long-term, so that young people are always critically building skills in ways that benefit the entire community.
Well, Monique, you kind of foreshadowed one of the next questions, which was really about innovation solutions that maybe we've heard of to help a young person connect to permanent work after the program is over. So what we're talking about is that year-round engagement. I don't know if Shuna, you want to jump in, or Mike want to jump in, because I know we have tons of partners who are intentionally doing that. And I know that Los Angeles, who was featured in one of our earlier conversations in the fall, really talked about this year-round model that they had, in which summer is a part of it. And so that's the way they've approached summer youth employment. It's just youth employment year-round. So Shuna or Mike, do you want to jump in about connecting young people to permanent work or long-term opportunities after the summer?
I can take a stab first. I mean, I think it's for young people who are concurrently connected to education. So high school students are the majority of summer youth participants. There's school-based models, which were gaining some traction in New York City before getting thrown off with the pandemic last year. And then for everybody, because it's critical that these programs be open to sort of an age-based range of youth and young adults. I think what programs can do is add takeaways. I'd say takeaways using a framework. Here to Here, an organization in New York City, released a short white paper earlier this year with 4 key distinguishers for virtual paid work experiences, but they're really similar ones that could apply to any internship or work-based learning: resources, connections, relevance, and takeaways. And takeaways there are that those experiences should be not just paid, but also offer credits or certifications or lay the foundation for future roles. The challenging thing, I think, is, and you all know this, is that in serving such a diverse population in terms of where young people are in their educational journeys, that is difficult to do. But that's why an ecosystem approach is so important. You know, a summer jobs in smaller communities, this is more difficult, but even in smaller communities, you can have multiple tracks geared to ages and stages, and therefore differentiate what the supports are. And I can think in Hartford, Connecticut, as the group working on preparing for the summer jobs program that year, led by the local workforce board, was working closely with the school district, with the local collective impact initiative focused on cradle to career success, on targeting young people who had just graduated from high school and making sure that while they were being engaged through their summer work experience, they were also being connected to college advisement, post-secondary transition support, so that that work experience could inform and flow into a next step for them rather than it falling off.
Thank you, Mike. Another question, because I know we are winding down on time, is folks were curious of what are you doing this summer? As we know, schools are reopening and with hybrid approaches. And so if you would drop in the chat, if you're still with us, are you doing virtual or hybrid approach as you're thinking about SYEP this summer? And then Shuna, won't you tell us what you all are thinking about in Detroit?
So in Detroit, we have a couple of pathways to the experience, as many cities do. So certain pathways are going to allow face-to-face experiences, and it will be limited, however, to those that are 18 and older. And so that will be for the internships specifically with employers. And so the employers who still have a workforce going, have the safety protocols in place. And so the young people can move into those experiences for the summer. For the majority of our program and population, however, it will remain 100% virtual. So those face-to-face experiences will be limited. We took a lot of lessons from last year, and so we're going to build on the experience to keep it meaningful. It will be quite a bit more robust than last summer. I say to people, and some will disagree, but some of our kids, I tell them that's the easiest $1,000 you probably ever made. So get ready. And so we, obviously have more time to think and plan for summer of 2020. And so that's underway and where we're headed.
Thank you. I think we have time for this. And thank you all for putting what you are planning or to do in the chat. I think this is really good information for us to have as we share out to the rest of the folks who weren't able to join us, but also as we continue to really think about how we can be advocates and partners with all of you. We know it's hard to collect documentation, right? Without being in a pandemic. But Shuna, this last question, how did you all think about or how did you collect documents so that as social security cards, ID and so forth during COVID?
Ooh, one of my favorite topics. So last summer, obviously we had to invent and create what we needed to do right away. We had been planning for moving in the direction of electronic registration and collection of documents, but we were planning it actually for 2021. So we had to ramp that up very quickly in 2020. We used a combination of a platform called Jot Forms and Google Docs, Google Forms, and it actually worked really well. This year, we had the advantage of partnering with a vendor to really build out a custom system the way that we would really like it to work. And so we're moving to an electronic process where young people will upload all of their documentation. We can review it, comment on it, have conversations back and forth until we get everything that we need and are able to move them forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Talk about pivot, right? And innovation and getting in where you fit in so that you can definitely provide these opportunities for young people. So we are at the close of our session. We want to thank all of you for joining us and taking time out of your afternoon to hear some lessons learned from the summer of 2020, where we know many communities were unsure whether or not they were going to be able to host and support young people in terms of summer youth employment experiences. But you all proved them wrong and did a yeoman's job in doing that. And so we want to thank everyone also for joining us in this 3-part series with our partners, where we dug deep into one particular city's experience, had a practitioners discussion and convening, and then had this webinar as we think about policy and program considerations. So what are our next steps? We don't want to say goodbye. We will continue as CLASP and Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions to continue to better understand what is going to happen in 2021. How can we think about increased resources with public and private funders to be flexible, to help you continue to innovate, and to help have long-term support for youth employment, economic opportunity, work-based learning, education and training programs, of which summer youth employment programs is one critical strategy in which I know many of us had the privilege of experiencing when we were teens and in our early 20s. Please be on the lookout for a post from CLASP and Aspen Institute next week, which would have all the recordings for today's session, our fact sheets, which are released, but will be blasted out to the universe. And also be on the lookout for, if you want to be engaged in our ongoing advocacy efforts. We know that is critical during this time, and we have to make sure that our congressional leaders and our leaders in the White House definitely hear us. So we want to thank everyone in the class, the Aspen National Youth Employment Coalition, National League of Cities, teams for supporting us on this journey, for all of you, for Shuna, and we want to say have a great afternoon.